All right, let's just dive right in. Welcome to this explainer on a seriously fascinating aerodynamic phenomenon. It's something literally every pilot experiences, but let's be honest, it's also something a lot of us struggle to fully wrap our heads around at first. Today, we're taking those dry, textbook aerodynamics and translating them into vital, potentially life-saving knowledge for the cockpit. Yep, we are talking about ground effect.
You know that feeling, right? Think back to your early flight lessons. Or hey, maybe even your most recent one. Have you ever noticed that totally confusing sensation right as you're flaring to land, where it feels like you're just floating endlessly past your touchdown point? Or what about during takeoff? Ever felt that deceptive, sudden surge of lift right after you rotate, making the plane feel like it's eager to fly way before it really should be? It begs the question, why does an airplane suddenly seem to fly so much better when it's just mere inches from the runway?
Well, to answer that, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover what is ground effect, the aerodynamics behind it, the takeoff danger zone, floating during landing, and finally, mastering the transition. Okay, Section 1. What is ground effect? And defining the boundaries. We really need to figure out exactly where this aerodynamic shift actually takes place. So here is the absolute golden rule you need to commit to memory. 1 wingspan. That's the magic boundary. The Earth's surface begins interfering with your airplane's airflow when you get within approximately 1 wingspan of the ground. Above that height, you're in normal, everyday flight. But the absolute second you descend below that invisible line, the physics around your wings begin to drastically change. And what's really wild is that this effect isn't just an on and off switch. To put it into perspective, think about a standard Cessna 172. It has roughly a 36-foot wingspan. So, at 36 feet up, 1 full wingspan, ground effect is there, but it's pretty mild. But as you descend to around 1/4 of a wingspan, which is roughly 9 feet off the ground, induced drag drops noticeably. Your lift becomes much more efficient. And by the time you're down to 1/10 of a wingspan, just 3.5 feet off the ground, you are in strong ground effect. Downwash and wingtip vortices are at an absolute minimum here. And that is exactly why your aircraft suddenly just wants to stay airborne and float forever. Moving right along to Section 2, the aerodynamics behind it, visualizing the invisible. Let's uncover what's actually happening to the air around your wing. To really get ground effect, you have to contrast normal high-altitude flight against flying right above the ground. Normally, when you're cruising along up high, you've got high pressure underneath the wing and lower pressure on top. Now, nature absolutely hates an imbalance, so those high-pressure air molecules try to sneak around the wingtip to the low-pressure area on top. This creates those swirling wingtip vortices you've probably heard about, which actually destroy a portion of your lift and create a strong downward flow of air called downwash. Lots of downwash means high induced drag. But near the ground, that hard surface of the Earth literally physically blocks those airflow patterns from fully forming. The ground just gets right in the way. So, with the ground physically getting in the way of those vortices, what do you think happens? Does ground effect increase or decrease drag? Well, the answer is huge. It decreases drag. Out of ground effect, those massive wingtip vortices and strong downwash tilt your whole lift vector backwards. That rearward tilt, that's induced drag, meaning you need a lot more engine power just to maintain flight. But in ground effect, because the ground disrupts the vortices and they can't expand, the downwash is significantly weakened. Suddenly, your lift vector stands up much more vertically. Less rearward tilt means drastically less induced drag. The airplane literally flies better, requiring way less power to maintain its altitude. Which brings us to Section 3, the takeoff danger zone, the illusion of flight. Let's see how all this aerodynamic help can actually build into a potentially fatal trap during takeoff. Let me tell you a rather sobering cautionary tale from Lake Tahoe. That airport sits at a high elevation, about 6,300 feet. On a hot day, the density altitude there can be incredibly high, meaning the air is super thin. A pilot was taking off, and instead of relying on his airspeed indicator, his technique was just to look out the window. When the runway seemed to be blurring by fast enough, he hauled back on the yoke. Because of ground effect, that magic cushion of low drag we just talked about, the airplane easily popped off the runway. But it didn't have the actual performance to climb in that thin air once it left that 1 wingspan boundary. He flew the entire length of the runway just 5 feet off the ground, and tragically hit a tree at the end. People later blamed ground effect, but as the saying goes, pilots cause accidents, not ground effect. Ground effect is just physics. It's up to us to respect it. Because leaving the runway early, it's literally an illusion of flight. The aircraft gets trapped in a low drag bubble. Since induced drag is practically non-existent right near the runway,
the airplane can lift off at a speed that is completely insufficient to actually climb. If you pull that nose up before reaching the manufacturer's recommended rotation speed, your VR, you are basically tricking the airplane into flying before it has the energy to stay flying.
It's a terrifying sequence. First, you rotate early, and the wheels leave the ground because of that artificially low drag. Second, the airplane floats, and it feels awesome. It feels like you're flying. But third, as you try to climb toward that one wingspan boundary, ground effect rapidly vanishes. Wingtip vortices fully form, downwash spikes, and suddenly you hit a massive wall of drag. Fourth, your climb performance completely tanks. You have no airspeed, no extra power, and if you make the deadly mistake of holding a nose-high attitude to try and force the climb, well, that quickly leads to an accelerated stall with absolutely no altitude to recover. The fix? You must wait for the recommended VR and aggressively accelerate to your best angular rate of climb speeds, Vx or Vy, to punch through that boundary safely.
All right, Section 4, Floating During Landing, the Frustration Zone. Let's look at where this exact same aerodynamic phenomenon causes that endless, super annoying float when you're trying to land.
We've all been there. Because induced drag completely plummets as you enter ground effects near the runway, the airplane suddenly needs far less lift to maintain level flight. What does that mean for you? It means if you carry even a tiny bit of excess airspeed into your flare, the airplane is flat out going to refuse to land. That extra energy has to go somewhere, right? And without the normal drag there to bleed it off, it just converts into a prolonged float, eating up hundreds or even thousands of feet of valuable runway. And if you get impatient and try to force the nose down, you're almost guaranteed to balloon back up, or worse, suffer a hard landing that could seriously damage the gear.
The practical solution here is actually super straightforward. First, stabilize your approach exactly at your recommended approach speed, your VREF. That's usually 1.3 times your stall speed in the landing configuration. Do not tack on an extra 5 or 10 knots just for comfort. Second, execute a smooth, timely flare. And third, just be patient. Let the airspeed dissipate naturally during the flare. As the speed bleeds off, the lift will decay, and the airplane will simply settle onto the runway right where you want it.
Which leads us to Section 5, Mastering the Transition and the Golden Rules for the Cockpit. We've talked about the theory, the dangers, and the frustrations. Now let's tie it all together.
It really all comes down to building incredibly safe flying habits. Here are your golden rules. 1. Rotate strictly at the manufacturer's recommended VR speed. Never yank the airplane off the ground just because the controls feel light. 2. Ensure you accelerate to Vx or Vy to establish a positive, solid climb through that one wingspan boundary. 3. Fly your approaches at the exact VREF speed, because good energy management starts miles before you even reach the runway. And 4. Manage your energy carefully in the flare, letting the airplane settle on its own terms. Always remember, ground effect isn't magic. It's just aerodynamics, and it demands to be respected through strict energy management.
So, I'll leave you with a challenge for your next flight lesson. Are you ready to actively master this invisible transition? The next time you cross that one wingspan boundary, whether you're lifting off or coming down, don't just sit there and react to the airplane. Anticipate the aerodynamic shift. Watch your airspeed, respect the energy, and you'll find that once you truly understand ground effect, the airplane's behavior starts to make perfect, predictable sense.